Let me share with you a truth that might explain the exhaustion you feel at the end of each day. It's not your job that's wearing you down. It's not the endless notifications or the mounting responsibilities. It's something that happens in the quiet spaces between your thoughts, in those moments when your mind refuses to be still. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, writing in 1844, identified a peculiar form of suffering that would define the modern condition long before smartphones existed, before social media turned every moment into a choice, before we had infinite options for everything from breakfast cereals to life partners. He called it the dizziness of freedom, and it's the reason why thinking too much is slowly destroying your peace of mind. Imagine standing at the edge of a tall building, looking down into the abyss below. You feel two contradictory impulses simultaneously, the terror of falling and the strange, inexplicable urge to jump. This moment, when you're caught between possibility and paralysis, between infinite choice and absolute uncertainty, is what Kierkegaard identified as the fundamental anxiety of human existence. But here's what makes his insight devastating for our time. In the 19th century, people had perhaps a dozen major choices to make in their lifetime. Today, you make that many choices before lunch. Every moment becomes an abyss of possibility, every decision a source of that same existential vertigo. As Kierkegaard wrote in The Concept of Anxiety, anxiety is freedom's actuality as the possibility of possibility. Now, we'll explore why your overthinking isn't a character flaw. It's the inevitable result of being truly free, and why understanding this ancient wisdom might be the key to finding peace in our age of infinite choice. Kierkegaard identified what he called the 3 stages on life's way, but hidden within his analysis is a subtler understanding of how overthinking progressively destroys our capacity for authentic living. These stages reveal why the modern epidemic of analysis paralysis isn't just inconvenient, it's spiritually devastating. The first stage Kierkegaard called the aesthetic, the life of immediate pleasure and constant stimulation. In our time, this manifests as what we might recognize as the endless scroll of social media, the pursuit of experiences for their own sake, the attempt to avoid anxiety through perpetual distraction. The aesthetic individual lives in what Kierkegaard called the rotation method, constantly seeking new experiences to avoid confronting deeper questions about meaning and purpose. But here's where Kierkegaard's insight becomes psychologically profound. The aesthetic life inevitably leads to increased anxiety because it avoids the very choices that would give life meaning. When you live primarily for pleasure and immediate gratification, you remain in what he called a state of immediacy, never fully becoming a self because you never take responsibility for creating yourself through deliberate choices. Modern psychology confirms this pattern. Studies on what researchers call experiential avoidance show that people who chronically avoid difficult emotions and decisions actually experience higher levels of anxiety and depression over time. The very strategies we use to avoid anxiety, endless entertainment, compulsive busyness, perfectionist planning, end up creating more of the psychological distress we're trying to escape. The second stage Kierkegaard called the ethical, the life of duty, rules, and social conformity. This is where most overthinkers get trapped. The ethical individual tries to resolve anxiety through what contemporary psychology calls cognitive control, the belief that if you just think hard enough, plan thoroughly enough, and follow the right principles, you can eliminate uncertainty from your life. In Either Or, Kierkegaard writes, the ethical individual is transparent to himself and does not live in a paradox. But this transparency comes at a cost. It requires constant self-monitoring, endless analysis of whether you're living up to your own moral standards, perpetual worry about whether you're making the right choices according to universal principles. This is the stage where anxiety becomes intellectualized. Instead of feeling the raw uncertainty of existence, you try to think your way out of it. You make pro and con lists for major decisions. You research endlessly before making purchases. You seek expert advice for everything from parenting to career choices. You believe that somewhere out there is enough information to make perfect choices, if only you can find it and analyze it properly. But Kierkegaard saw that this ethical stage creates its own form of despair, what he called the sickness unto death. In The Sickness Unto Death, he writes, the self is a relation which relates itself to its own self, or it is that in the relation that the relation relates itself to its own self. This dense formulation describes the psychological hell of excessive self-reflection, when your consciousness becomes so focused on analyzing itself that you lose touch with immediate experience. Modern research on what psychologists call metacognition, thinking about thinking, supports Kierkegaard's observation. Studies show that people prone to anxiety disorders often get caught in what researchers call metacognitive worry. They worry about their worrying, analyze their anxiety, and try to control their mental states through pure mental effort. This creates exactly the kind of recursive loops that Kierkegaard identified as spiritually destructive. The third stage Kierkegaard called the religious, but this isn't conventional religiosity, it's what he called the leap of faith. The recognition that some fundamental questions about existence cannot be resolved through thinking and must instead be embraced through decisive action despite uncertainty. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard writes, "The paradox of faith is this, that the individual is higher than the universal." What he means is that authentic existence requires making choices that can't be justified by universal principles or rational analysis. You must choose who to marry not because you can prove they're objectively the best person for you, but because something in you responds to their presence. You must choose a career not because market research guarantees success, but because something calls to your deepest capacities. This religious stage doesn't eliminate anxiety, it transforms it. Instead of seeing anxiety as a problem to be solved through more thinking, you begin to recognize it as information about your freedom. The anxiety you feel when contemplating major life choices isn't a sign that you need more data. It's a sign that you're approaching a moment where you must take responsibility for creating yourself through irreversible action. If Kierkegaard could see our contemporary world, he would recognize it as the perfect laboratory for studying anxiety. We have created a civilization that maximizes the very conditions he identified as most psychologically destabilizing: infinite choice, constant information, and the illusion that perfect decisions are possible through sufficient analysis. Consider the simple act of choosing a restaurant for dinner. A century ago, you had perhaps 2 or 3 options in your town. Today, apps like Yelp or DoorDash present you with hundreds of options, each with detailed reviews, photos, and ratings that promise to help you make the optimal choice. What should be a simple decision becomes what Kierkegaard would recognize as a source of existential anxiety. You're confronted with infinite possibility and the burden of choosing correctly. But the real psychological damage happens when this pattern repeats across every aspect of life. Dating apps present seemingly infinite romantic options. Career websites suggest countless professional paths. Social media shows you endless lifestyle possibilities. Netflix offers thousands of entertainment choices. Each decision point triggers what researchers now call decision fatigue, the deterioration of decision quality after a long session of making choices. Kierkegaard predicted this exhaustion in The Present Age, written in 1846. The present age is essentially one of understanding, and on the average of reflection, without passion, flaring up in superficial, short-lived enthusiasm and prudentially relaxing in indolence. He saw that when thinking becomes substituted for living, people become what he called spectators of their own existence. Modern psychology has validated this insight through research on what's called rumination, the tendency to repetitively focus on the symptoms, causes, and consequences of distress. Studies consistently show that people who engage in chronic rumination experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, and decision-making paralysis. They become trapped in what researchers call analysis paralysis, the state of overthinking a decision to the point where no decision is made. Social media amplifies this dynamic by creating what Kierkegaard would call the crowd, the anonymous mass of other people's opinions that drowns out your ability to hear your own authentic responses to life. When choosing a career, you don't just consider your own interests and abilities. You're bombarded with LinkedIn posts about successful career moves, articles about future job markets, and comparison with peers' carefully curated professional achievements. The result is what contemporary psychologists call compare and despair, the tendency to measure your internal reality against others' external presentations. But Kierkegaard understood this phenomenon at a deeper level. In Two Ages, he writes, "A passionate, tumultuous age will overthrow everything, pull everything down. But a revolutionary age, that is at the same time reflective and passionless, transforms that expression of strength into a feat of dialectics." What he meant is that when a culture becomes too reflective, too analytical, it loses the capacity for decisive action. People become skilled at analyzing problems, but paralyzed when it comes to making the irreversible choices that create authentic selfhood. They can discuss the pros and cons of different life paths endlessly, but struggle to commit fully to any single path. This shows up in contemporary phenomena like emerging adulthood, the extended period of exploration and identity formation that now stretches well into the 30s for many people. While some of this reflects expanded opportunities, Kierkegaard would recognize it as a form of what he called aesthetic living, the attempt to keep all possibilities open rather than accepting the anxiety that comes with definitive choice. The paradox is that this attempt to avoid the anxiety of choice actually creates more anxiety. Research on what psychologists call maximizers versus satisficers shows that people who try to make optimal choices, maximizers, are less happy and more regret-prone than people who make good enough choices, satisficers. The maximizers experience exactly what Kierkegaard called the dizziness of freedom. They become overwhelmed by the awareness of all the options they're not choosing. Technology companies exploit this psychological vulnerability through what behavioral economists call choice architecture, designing systems that present infinite options while creating the illusion that perfect choices are discoverable through sufficient research. But Kierkegaard understood that perfect choices don't exist, not because information is inadequate, but because existence itself is fundamentally uncertain and ambiguous. Kierkegaard's solution to the problem of overthinking was radical for his time and remains challenging for ours. He advocated for what he called the leap, decisive action in the face of irreducible uncertainty. But this wasn't mere impulsiveness. It was what he called passionate commitment, the willingness to stake your life on choices that cannot be fully justified through rational analysis. In concluding unscientific postscript, Kierkegaard writes, "Without risk, no faith. Faith is precisely the contradiction between the infinite passion of the individual's inwardness and the objective uncertainty." What he meant is that authentic living requires accepting that some of life's most important decisions must be made without sufficient data, and that this uncertainty isn't a bug in the system. It's the feature that makes human freedom possible. Consider how this applies to the decision of whether to have children. No amount of research can tell you whether you'll be a good parent, whether children will bring meaning to your life, or whether you can afford the financial and emotional costs. Yet people torture themselves trying to analyze this decision rationally, weighing pros and cons as if it were a business investment rather than an existential commitment. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy has rediscovered this insight through techniques like behavioral experiments, taking action despite anxiety to learn from experience rather than trying to resolve uncertainty through mental analysis. The goal isn't to eliminate anxiety, but to develop what researchers call anxiety tolerance, the capacity to move forward with important life choices while carrying uncertainty. As Kierkegaard wrote in his journal, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." The tragedy of overthinking is that it attempts to live life backwards, to understand everything before acting. But understanding comes through committed action, not endless deliberation. The anxiety you feel facing an uncertain future isn't a problem to be solved. It's information about your freedom and the invitation to discover who you are through the choices you're willing to stake your life on. As we draw our exploration to a close, let us return to Kierkegaard's most profound insight. The anxiety that keeps you turning possibilities over in your mind like stones in your hand isn't evidence of weakness or dysfunction. It is the signature of your freedom, the proof that you possess something remarkable and terrible, the capacity to create yourself through irreversible choices. Kierkegaard understood what our age of infinite information has forgotten, that some questions cannot be answered by thinking, only by living. The partner you should marry, the work that will fulfill you, the life that will feel authentic. These discoveries await not in more analysis, but in the courage to commit despite uncertainty. As he wrote in The Sickness Unto Death, "The most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. Your overthinking is a form of premature nostalgia, mourning paths not taken before you've even chosen a path to walk." Consider carrying with you Kierkegaard's invitation to what he called the leap of faith, not blind belief, but passionate commitment to choices that express your deepest understanding of who you are becoming. Let your thoughts be less about analyzing endless possibilities and more about the quiet confidence that comes from accepting the beautiful uncertainty of being human. In the words that conclude, the concept of anxiety. The self is a relation which relates itself to its own self. May you relate to yourself not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be lived.